Eileen, thank you again for agreeing to join us today.
Thank you, Aniket. I'm really pleased to be here.
Excellent. So for our listeners listening to this, can you describe your background and your role a little bit?
Sure, just briefly. I spent a career in the investment management landscape in a number of different roles. First, as a buyer of investment services, as a consultant, and then as a portfolio manager. My 18 years that I spent at JP Morgan was within the US equity team, but at the same time, I was also chair of the governance committee there. Since I retired from JP Morgan, I am a senior counselor at Abernathy MacGregor, which is a global communications firm.
I'd like to start with some recent news, if that's okay with you. Recently, the SEC brought forward the first major enforcement action since they created their ESG task force back in March 2021. And it revolved around a corporation's ESG disclosures and particularly about certain misleading statements that resulted in violations of Section 10B of the Exchange Act and Section 17 of the Securities Act. It's quite evident that ESG reporting and open communication is vital for a corporation. But how can an organization avoid a misleading statement or similar risks associated with ESG reporting?
Very topical question. Thank you for asking. The company that you reference had a very significant tragedy back in 2019. And the company published false information about its safety metrics and in a number of different publications, including its sustainability report, its webinars, and in investor presentations. Unfortunately, the falsification of this information didn't come to light until a horrific accident, which cost the lives of 270 people. So the company has correctly been cited. And just recently, just the other day, by the way, I read that the SEC is bringing charges of the company for securities fraud. So that puts a whole new light on this potential issue. How can companies avoid going down this path? First of all, I do personally take the side of cautionary disclosure. And by the way, I need to make my own disclosure statement here by expressing that my views represent my own points of view and not representative of any company that I'm affiliated with. Once a metric is published and put out there by a company, it is in print and it's so difficult to retract it. So a couple of things. The data has to be measurable and it has to be accurate. So companies need to really think about what they want to put out there. KPIs or key performance indicators really should be relevant to how the business is run. And I'm kind of cautious of where companies want to disclose this information, whether it's a formal SEC filing or in a sustainability report, which is still used by investors and the public, but is not necessarily covered under SEC disclosure rules and regs. It's kind of a voluntary disclosure. Regardless of whether or not we witness an SEC formal climate disclosure mandate by the end of June, disclosure on these topics and these issues are not going away. So companies need to step back, take some time to think about what it is that's relevant to their business and in what format they would like to disclose it. It's important to note, by the way, that in March of this year, the SEC announced its exam priorities, its enforcement exam priorities, with an enhanced focus on 5 areas, one of which is ESG. So the ESG task force in the Division of Enforcement is going to be paying very close attention going forward, again, regardless of whether or not we have formal disclosure rules by the SEC or not. And so I would expect heightened intensity by the SEC in looking at statements and data that companies are producing. And one thing that I would like to mention, it's important to note that ESG disclosure is not just focused on corporate America, but also on the investment industry, in particular, how portfolio managers at investment firms are applying ESG information to their portfolio holdings. And in addition, how these firms are voting their proxies in accordance with stated published guidelines and views on ESG issues. The SEC is very focused on how these funds are marketed. And we've run into this terminology called greenwashing that has really caught the attention of so many in the marketplace. Invested, by the way, in a survey in 2021 by a UK investment survey, 44% of investors were very concerned about greenwashing. So it is a heightened area of interest, there's no doubt. Of course, I just would like to make a following recommendation. Before any information is released, I think any company needs to step back and review its value mission to its stakeholders. Now, we're in a stakeholder environment more so today than ever before. Why are investors holding your stock? Why do employees want to work for your company? Are your customers satisfied? These are all very important questions that companies need to address, which gets to, in many ways, the culture of a company. And any published report or any information that a company wants to disclose must reflect what it is important to keep the enterprise successful. So unfortunately, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to your question. Companies need to assess their issues, their own issues, how it's relevant to their functioning of their enterprise, taking into consideration the stakeholders that are interested in their company. One of the things that I would recommend for companies certainly who haven't gotten started in the disclosure proliferation here is that companies should look at what their industry peers may be doing. I'm not saying that they should copy what their peers are doing. It may not be relevant to their business, but to get started, it would be helpful to look at what other companies of their size or of their industry are discussing and whether or not that makes sense to them or whether or not it doesn't, or how they can improve upon the information to make the company's brand stand out a bit better than its peer group.
It's very interesting. And, going down the same lines of this corporate communications route, recently there's been a significant trend for corporations to release statements about topical issues in the social sector, particularly. We could see examples from Disney and Florida House Act 1557 and Coca-Cola and the Elections Integrity Act. Do you believe, or how do you see corporations playing a role in making statements about the recent leaked draft Roe v. Wade decision?
Wow, such a topical issue. We are currently, working with a number of clients on exactly that question. What should they say, if anything? How should they say it? And what does it all mean? So it's really all a work in progress. And again, there's no real one answer to that question, but there's no doubt about it that many of the social issues are becoming politicized issues, and employees are expecting, I think a survey suggested that about 60 or some odd more % of employees want their CEO to make a statement on such issues. So the pressure on CEOs and companies generally is high right now. It's just a difficult balance to achieve because any position, as we know, a company may take could offend certain constituencies, not just their employees, but maybe their customers or others that they do business with, or even their shareholders. So companies need to really take time to assess what their business exposure is to the issue. That's number one. is there a financial and business exposure to the topic at hand? There is no real one answer. We saw that what happened with Disney and Coca-Cola, their first reactions were really not to say anything, and that was backlash. Their employees in particular really had strong backlash on that approach. Interestingly enough, just the other day, we saw the CEO of Sony PlayStation come out with a statement about abortion rights, not wanting to make a big issue about it, but then went on to talk about his cats in the next 4 paragraphs, which also got tremendous backlash in terms of messaging. At the same token, a subsidiary of the same company, Bungie, its CEO came out with a completely different take on abortion rights, being supportive of women's rights in that regard. So within the same company, you had 2 CEOs of divisions coming out with very different perspectives. To us, that's a minefield. Companies need to make sure at the very top that they are addressing the issue if they want to publicly address the issue, and that they speak with one voice for the entire company. So that's just an example of how the messaging is out there in the public, but not really vetted internally with all of the correct audiences. The Roe v. Wade situation is going to be, again, a very difficult environment for companies generally. We have to wait, obviously, for the final court's decision. Some states have already codified protections for women. And in fact, there are 16 states in the United States which provide abortion access, and New York is in the process of embellishing or enhancing its own laws regarding that. Some companies have made very supportive announcements, like Apple, Citibank, Salesforce, Uber and Lyft have made comments that they would provide transportation for women in Texas and Oklahoma to seek services in other states. And I thought it was interesting, GoDaddy kicked a Texas whistleblower organization off of its website. So companies are taking a position, at least some companies are, and some states are taking a position. But we note that the states may not, in and of themselves, have, or give full protection to the companies that are headquartered in those states. So in addition, if companies offer healthcare benefits under ERISA, which is a federal protection law for employees, they may have preemptive standing over state law for those states that prohibit reproductive rights for women. This would be obviously tested in the courts. So there is now a lot of discussion about ERISA preemptive rights and company-specific positions within certain states. Not definitive, and again, it will get tested in the courts. By the way, I just noticed that on the upcoming annual meetings at 3 of the largest retailers, Walmart, TJX, and I think Kohl's, there is shareholder proposals on the proxy ballot already asking these companies to provide a report by year end, which will delineate the risks and the costs of any of these state abortion rights being implemented, since these organizations have employees probably in most, if not all, of the states of the United States. They will be impacted on their employee level at some point. So shareholders are already asking companies to provide a report that would describe their exposure in these states to such issues. So there's no single corporate checklist or formula, I'm sorry to say, that companies could follow to address these challenges. Again, the company needs to look at its unique stakeholders, the impact of any proposed legislation and issues on their stakeholders and their business, and craft a communication approach that addresses the issue at hand. Corporate culture matters. I'm going to say it again. This is important. Corporate culture matters here. A diverse culture within an organization will get in the way, diverse opinion, let me put it that way, will get in the way of a cogent message, like we saw in the Sony executives speaking on different levels on the same topic. And the broader purpose has to be made clear. It may be taken out of context. It may provide a backlash like we saw in Disney and Coca-Cola. While the intention may have been on the right path, the messaging was not done in a way to garner support. Internal issues that can compound the issue and the messaging are also very key. Again, the company needs to speak with one voice. That does not just include the stakeholders, but also the board of directors. So let's not forget that if a CEO is going to make a statement about these very politicized issues, directors may themselves be, well, they should at least be included in what that message is. Many board directors have and or pressured both politically and from social arenas to present a particular point of view. And so the company may be putting a particular director in a difficult situation if the messaging, again, is not vetted at the board in addition to the other stakeholders I mentioned. So companies need to first understand a couple of issues on the Roe v. Wade. What are your healthcare benefits? How does it impact women's rights? And what is your protection under ERISA? So every company first needs to just get all that information and understand what that means before they start putting out any public announcements on their actions. I would like to suggest for every company that there will be even more intense scrutiny on PACs and political contributions for every company. It's already a big shareholder topic. It will become an employee activist topic as well. So companies need to understand and assess where they are delivering PAC money. This does get published. And unfortunately, I think it winds up talked about in the press with pretty misleading conclusions. Companies have to understand and assess what their risks are in terms of their PAC programs and how they will address that in the future. So again, I just remind everyone on the listening to speak with one voice, make sure that all your stakeholders are on board, as many of them as you can. And policy and regulators really need to hear a consistent message from the company on these topics.
Certainly a very live topic and an important one. So I'm sure our listeners will benefit from your answer to that question. Shifting gears slightly, you spoke a little bit about your experience, and I understand you're part of the member of the advisory council for the SASB reporting framework. How in your experience has the reporting framework evolved, and what do you think the future of the framework is, and maybe some challenges or the bright side?
Yeah, so we've come a long way with regard to data collection and disclosure. SASB's importance in the day-to-day lexicon of ESG reporting has really grown since its inception. And the organization has now a really strong hold on the ESG conversation. So I give them high marks on coming through. In the beginning, which I guess dates back to 2011, the structure and the program was fairly problematic, actually. There were too many metrics that were being required. Investors questioned the relevancy of those metrics. Many of the data points didn't make sense to them. Investors weren't focused, by the way, at the time on those data points, falling back on the fact that many of the data points didn't seem to be material under the SEC formal definition of materiality for disclosure purposes. Additionally, in the beginning, industries and corporations felt that their input was sorely lacking. While they were included to some point, they weren't included to the extent that their objections were being heard. And so a lot of the early work was really shifted towards the other constituencies that were having a voice, and companies felt pretty much left out of that conversation. I will say that perseverance and a reorganization in and of itself of SASB did pay off. It took the organization a couple of years and through a lot of iterations, but to get the data set and to get the industry classifications in a good place. SASB was smart in the latter years to recognize that there are other reporting frameworks. In fact, many complain there are just too many reporting frameworks, and that we'll get to that point in a minute. But they recognize the fact that they have a lot of other competing reporting frameworks, and they found a niche or a place for themselves by complementing other regimes like GRI or the TCFD. So they've become almost like a partner in reporting for many companies who found it just so daunting a task to begin filling out all of the individual questionnaires. SASB finalized its industry classifications in 2018, and so there are 77 of them today. They developed their own codes for classification. They call them SIC codes. I don't think a company should feel daunted by the fact that they're not standard NAIC or GIC codes, which most investors or business organizations reference for classification. But what SASB has done with the industries is group companies into their risk and opportunity profiles. And I think that's pretty interesting. I think if an industry or a company wants to look at their SASB industry classification, it might give them interesting information about what their risks are looking like to outsiders and what their opportunities are looking like to outsiders. It may provide interesting, insightful information about where the company is placed from that perspective. So I think that's going to be helpful for companies to take a look at that. So one thing I do want to remind the audience is that SASB is now a brand name for the data set. The company, through merger and consolidation, is now known as the ISSB, or will soon be known as the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, and its perspective is global in nature. Again, I talked about the angst about how much ESG data compilers there are out there, and there still are quite a bit, but it is potentially costly, particularly for small companies, to decide or to participate in filling out a lot of these data sets. And in particular, the SEC, one of the objections to the SEC climate disclosure rules is the cost benefit that goes with this additional disclosure that companies will have to adhere to if the rules are passed. So there is still a lot of discussion about the cost benefit of doing all of the disclosure formally with many of these organizations. But SASB has recognized that the disclosure regime is, companies have really taken it up, and their joining of the ISSB really puts them in the global arena of data disclosure. And we know that outside of the United States, disclosure of much of these metrics is expected and welcomed. And so their plan, I would think, speaking for the organization, their plan is to really be the key go-to data metrics organization globally. Whether or not the SEC passes its legislation at the end of June, companies will still use SASB to disclose the information that many investors want to see. In fact, I thought this was fairly impressive. About 65% of S&P companies already disclose using SASB information. So we started off with the organization a little bit tenuous, but through their own perseverance and growth and listening to a lot of feedback from a lot of audiences, they've gotten to a place where they now are the go-to, I think for the most part, one of the go-to regimes for disclosure of this information.
That's excellent. It's a great journey and a great overview of the evolution of the framework. Well, thank you again, Eileen. That was, I think, very informative for our listeners.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.